So I believe it is recording now. All right. Hi, everyone. So this talk is Pinfalls and Punchlines, the interface between pro wrestling and comedy. It's I'm going for breadth rather than depth here. So it's going to be a lot, and I appreciate any feedback. This is the beginning of a new project for me. All right. So I can't... Sorry. That's not what I want to do. Hold on, I'm gonna have to stop the share. I don't know how to control my PowerPoint while I share it.
It should just be you can click back on the PowerPoint to forward it.
Okay, but I wasn't able to. All right, I'll figure it out. Sorry. Okay, you can see it, right? Okay, cool. So I thought I'd start with a joke. This was the best wrestling joke I could find, so I hope it's funny. How many Vince McMahons does it take to screw in a light bulb? None. Light bulb screwed light bulb. All right. So here's the card. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to start with comparisons between pro wrestling and different comedy forms, such as stand-up, improv, and sketch. Then I'm going to talk about comedy wrestlers and promotions a little bit. And then the main part of this is going to be the place of comedy in wrestling. And part of that is, can comedy be the main event? And I'll have a little bit of a swerve towards the end into some other kinds of territory. First, some definitions. I'm a philosopher. I'm wearing my Action Philosophers t-shirt with Plato here. So we'll start with some definitions. First, definitions of comedy or humor according to philosophers. We'll start with superiority theory. And this is a version that comes from Thomas Hobbes. That the passion of laughter is nothing else but sudden glory, arising from some sudden conception of some eminency in ourselves by comparison with the infirmity of others or with our own formerly. So Hobbes thinks that humor relies on some kind of relation of superiority between the person who's laughing and, I guess, the butt of the joke. The idea is that there's always a butt of the joke. It's always at someone's expense. And even if it's yourself, your former self or something like that. Then we have Herbert Spencer, who has a version of relief theory. Laughter is the release of energy that must expend itself some way or another. And Sigmund Freud has a version of this theory as well. We have this pent-up energy, and laughter is just one way of releasing it. Then we get incongruity theory. And this is Immanuel Kant. In everything that is to excite a lively laugh, there must be something absurd, in which the understanding, therefore, can find no satisfaction. Laughter is an affection arising from the sudden transformation of a strained expectation into nothing. So the notion of absurdity being central here. And then we get from evolutionary theory, play theory. We come into the world endowed with an instinctive tendency to laugh and have this feeling in response to pains presented playfully. So it's a way of sort of coming to terms with our own pain and suffering, and it's something that we see in the play behavior of primates, for instance. Now, I think you should, if you're like me, reading these definitions, you think, oh, this all sounds like wrestling. That these definitions all seem like they might apply just as well to wrestling as to comedy, with maybe the exception of number 3, the incongruity theory. And this notion of the absurd in wrestling is something that I'm going to talk about a bunch here. I know some people who aren't wrestling fans who look at any wrestling and find it unintentionally comical because they just think it's absurd and stupid. And I think they're missing something. So I'm putting aside the idea that all of wrestling must be absurd. The question is whether the absurd as a sort of the content of wrestling is central or could play a central role in successful wrestling. Okay, now pro wrestling, according to me, this is a rough and ready set of characteristics. It's theatrical simulated combat. There's a vague boundary between the fictional world and the actual world, as Carrie Lynn talks about in her work, the idea that there's no fourth wall. Another way to think about it, which I haven't seen a lot of, is to think about it as a kind of augmented reality game, right? The reality of wrestling is sort of superimposed on the actual world. There's a vague boundary between actors and characters in that same way. There's a dynamic relationship between the performers and audience, and Kit talked about that, and Carrie Lynn does as well. Audience as co-creators in a way, but even beyond that, I would say not only are the audience co-creators, they are themselves partially constitutive of the art object or the locus of critical scrutiny, so that the crowd is actually part of the object, of the art object of what they're doing. That's part of what you're looking at and scrutinizing when you're scrutinizing wrestling critically. And they're also the actual medium that the wrestlers are working with. They're manipulating the audience the way that a painter would manipulate paint or a musician would manipulate sound. And because of all this, the experience of pro wrestling is inescapably social. So just putting that out there for the moment. Now getting into the comparison between wrestling and comedy, some previous comparisons. Roland Barthes, in his seminal essay, says wrestlers have a physique as peremptory as those of the characters of the Commedia dell'arte. We are dealing with a real human comedy. Some wrestlers who are great comedians entertain as much as a Molière character because they succeed in imposing an immediate reading of their inner nature. So here, Barthes is comparing wrestling characters with characters in comedy because of how much of an open book they are, how much the entire character can be read off of their gestures and things like that. Their entire interiority is expressed outwardly. So I mean, I think he's suggesting to some degree that wrestling is funny, but this is more of like an analogy. Similarly, Luc Stadel, in his 2013 paper talking about the place of wrestling in early cinema, says only by engaging the kind of exaggerated gesture and extremely physical manipulation in cartoons and slapstick comedy did the true form of wrestling emerge. Wrestling in its current form could be seen as serving a similar therapeutic function to slapstick, that is, in other words, of diffusing of destructive energy, albeit one that relies on the response of shouting rather than laughter. So Stadel, again, points out, which is obvious if you've ever watched wrestling, that there is much of slapstick comedy and things like that in it. But the point of wrestling is not necessarily to make you laugh, it's to make you shout, whether you're cheering or booing. Okay, so now some more comparisons that I want to draw between pro wrestling and stand-up comedy. To begin with, as we already talked about, they both seem to require an audience as an active participant to some extent. Like in wrestling, in stand-up comedy, you work off of the crowd, you respond to things that they're saying. Stand-up comedy, like wrestling, doesn't seem to work that well without a live audience. And just like in wrestling, controlling the audience and responding well to criticism, like heckling, is necessary for success. If you let the audience actually get under your skin, you're doomed to failure as a stand-up comedian or as a pro wrestler. If you're playing a heel, of course, you act like the audience is getting under your skin, but you can't actually let them control you. Jokes in wrestling matches share a common structure with all other forms of storytelling, right? There's a setup and then there's a resolution, whether it's the heat of the wrestling match and then the comeback and the finish, or in a joke, the setup and the punchline. And then sadly, stand-up comedians and wrestlers live very similar, often tragic lives. They live very solitary lives on the road, away from their families, in impersonal hotel rooms, and are unfortunately often victims of drug overdoses and suicide and things like that. It's the same for a lot of other traveling performers, but it seems especially to be the case with wrestlers and comedians. Okay, wrestlers who have done stand-up, we've got Colt Cabana, Dolph Ziggler, Chris Jericho on the bottom left, and Mick Foley. None of them have really been able to parlay their wrestling fame into very successful stand-up careers, but they've tried. And so there is this overlap to some degree. And then, of course, there is Andy Kaufman, who Chris Olsen was mentioned him a bit in the talk earlier today. He famously, besides being a comic, had this feud with Jerry Lawler and was doing a bunch of different wrestling down in Memphis. And if you ask Jerry Lawler, he'll tell you it's a mistake to think of Andy Kaufman as a comedian who tried wrestling. Andy Kaufman always thought himself as a wrestling heel. When he was doing his routines where he'd go up on stage and just eat a bowl of cereal and the crowd would boo him, he was trying to be a heel. So he thought maybe there wasn't such a difference between comedy and wrestling, that comedy could be more than just about getting laughs, that it could also be about getting other kinds of reactions, or he was just, again, like Lawler suggests, being a wrestling heel in the comedy world, in the wrestling world, and reportedly in his real life to a large degree as well, where his friends didn't even know when he was putting on an act and being the real Andy. Okay, now some comparisons between wrestling and sketch or improv. So much of wrestling is improvisational and reactive to the crowd, akin to improv comedy. So you're working with the other performers to try and put on a show, and often you have to improvise, and often you're taking cues from the crowd that you're working off of, as I was saying also about stand-up. Wrestling shows frequently involve backstage skits or sketches that are often comedic. So they have sketch comedy to some degree built into the wrestling shows. Wrestling schools and sketch improv troupes have very similar structures, especially these days, and face similar criticisms of exploitation of their work, because they do a lot of work and to put on the shows that's unpaid, that they're kind of cultish sorts of environments, that they, when somebody leaves or pisses off whoever's in charge, they feel like they've been banished to some degree. So there's a lot of comparisons to be drawn there. And we have pro wrestling themed improv and sketch shows where there's a question about whether they themselves are actual iterations of wrestling. So Upright Citizens Brigade had their own wrestling promotion kind of thing for a while, and you see even some wrestlers from Chikara, Fire Ant, and Green Ant participated. They have commentators. They didn't have an actual ring, just mats. On the other hand, you currently have Extremely Serious Wrestling, which sticks a little bit more to typical wrestling conventions. They have their own makeshift ring, as you can see here, with some gym mats and caution tape. Orange Cassidy and other wrestlers have taken part in Extremely Serious Wrestling. And so, there's a real question about whether this is a form of pro wrestling or just, as I say here, a pro wrestling themed sketch show. There are wrestlers who seem to be primarily, if not entirely, comedy wrestlers, that their entire deal, their entire character is meant to provoke laughter. You have the Kikutaro, who was the king of comedy wrestling in Japan, possibly the greatest ever. Santino Marella was very popular in WWE for a long time. R-Truth, unfortunately, despite the fact that he can do much else, I think has been pigeonholed into comedic roles. Colt Cabana is also, as I've mentioned before, is a great comedy wrestler. As is the case in a lot of forms of media where there's this misogynistic idea that women can't be funny or something like that, there aren't a ton of female comedy wrestlers. Alicia Fox was doing a comedic gimmick on WWE TV for a long time. There's some other women like Session Moth Martina, but I'd say as with the case of R-Truth, both with people of color and with women, usually the comedy is at their expense, right? They're the butt of the joke more often than not, and it's playing on misogynistic or racist tropes often. There are also comedy wrestling promotions. DDT in Japan is probably the most prominent. This is the Tokyo Dome here on the bottom left, where Minoru Suzuki, they actually did it with the baseball field there. And Minoru Suzuki, I suppose by touching the base, has broken the submission hold. We have all sorts of crazy characters in costumes. What I will say about these comedy promotions like DDT is despite a lot of their content being comedic, they usually have a serious main event. Their main title is defended in matches that are presented as more serious. Chikara, who has suffered an ignominious fate due to the actions of founder Mike Quackenbush, but for a very long time, they were, in America at least, the primary comedy promotion, and the performers did a lot of really cool, innovative stuff. You have the Osirian Portal doing their hypnotism gimmick on the left, and on the right, Chuck Taylor with his invisible hand grenade, which he is placing into the tights of poor Kodama here. And then there's Kaiju Big Battle, which is interesting because its audience isn't necessarily your typical indie wrestling audience, and they just go full on absurdity with characters like Burger Bear here, or Kung Fu Chicken Noodle, or Dusto Bunny, these wrestlers in these crazy monster costumes. But as much as they're funny a lot of the time, they also sort of play things straight, as it were. They at least in their main events for the most part. Same was true with Chikara. So this leads me to the question about the place of comedy in wrestling. Can comedy be the main event? And there's two parts to this. Can a comedy match be a main event match? And then can comedy wrestlers be main eventers? And I have a few examples here. One of them is the Mimosa Mayhem match between Orange Cassidy and Chris Jericho, which, while a funny concept, again, in the execution, was not played for laughs. It was played as a serious, dramatic match. Jericho said his inspiration was largely from Japanese death matches. He sold being about to fall into the mimosa as if he was about to fall onto C4 wrapped, barbed wire wrapped C4, as it were. Then you have the Stadium Stampede, which, as far as I know, is the closest thing to a comedy made event of a major pay-per-view ever. And it's very divisive, which I'll talk about a bunch later. But again, despite all of the laughs in the Stadium Stampede, in the end, the finish was about one team beating the other. And the reaction in the end was supposed to be cheers from a crowd that wasn't there, but at home at least, not laughter. And I think it's sort of an empirical question to ask whether a wrestling show that ended with the last beat and the last pop of the night, or the last pop of the main event being laughter rather than cheering or booing, would such a wrestling promotion be successful moving forward? Would they draw money? Would they continue to draw money in that way? And I think we don't really know that. We haven't seen the evidence for or against that yet. But again, like even with matches like the one on the bottom left, which is a match that Carrie Lynn brought to my attention between Orange Cassidy and Gentleman Jervis, as much as that match is largely comedy, even there, and it wasn't a main event, but it was a feature match on the show it was on. Even there, once they get to the finish, they do a bunch of serious wrestling, and the pop is supposed to be a cheer rather than a laugh in the end. Okay, so now moving on to the question of whether comedy wrestlers can be main eventers. So Ken Anderson recently was interviewed, and he said when he first debuted in WWE, he was over the top and sort of comedic in his delivery, and Vince McMahon tells him, "You've got to stop trying to be funny and entertaining." What? He says, "I remember thinking, isn't that the point of what we're trying to do here, to just be entertaining?" He said, "With all due respect, this is Vince, funny doesn't draw money." And that's really weird because, as Anderson points out, what about all of these major WWF and WWE stars who made tons of money in the Attitude Era, especially being funny? The Rock is the main example, Mick Foley, Kurt Angle, Stone Cold Steve Austin, D-Generation X, right? And King Booker, who we'll see this is particularly ironic, moving on, you know, his greatest success, he finally became world champion in the WWE once he donned a rather racist comedic gimmick. So what exactly is going on here? Well, here's where the swerve comes in, because I think this issue about comedy is really obscuring some other issues that are at play here. One of them has to do with conceptions of masculinity and competitiveness, what a wrestler should be like. Secondly, there's a specific issue with Vince McMahon of keeping certain characters in certain boxes. And then finally, there's this last issue of protecting the business. So let's start with the first one, conceptions of masculinity and competitiveness, and go to Booker T and his recent comments about Big E. And right from the beginning, he says, I think Big E is going to have to shed a few things in order for people to look at him like the world champion. The gear, maybe. Some forms of the gear, the colors. And Booker goes on to say, well, you know, this is really about the fact that, you know, you don't want to do the same thing that brought you to the dance, as it were, when you're moving to that next level. But underlying here, him talking about the gear, the colors, you know, is he talking about Big E wearing pink, right? Is he talking about Big E having unicorns on his attire? Is he talking about masculinity here? Is he suggesting that in order for Big E to be a star, he needs to look more traditionally masculine? He needs to shed some of these, you know, what Booker T might think of as effeminate or goofy aspects of his character. And I think that might really be what's going on here. And along those lines, you have a character like Orange Cassidy. And I'm especially thinking of his debate with Chris Jericho on AEW, where Orange Cassidy presents a very different kind of wrestling protagonist. What he revealed in the debate with Jericho is that the point of his character is not that he doesn't care about anything, but that he doesn't care about bullshit. He doesn't care about grandstanding and talking about how great he is and getting everybody to shower praise on him. He doesn't care about that. He doesn't care necessarily about proving to everyone that he's the best. He cares about doing his job well. He cares about global warming too, but he wants to do his job well. He wants to work hard and be the best wrestler he can be, but he doesn't need everybody to see him as the best. So this would even contrast him with a more traditional wrestler like Bret Hart, who maybe wasn't as like aggressive as, you know, Hulk Hogan or Roman Reigns or something like that, but still was constantly talking about how he's the best there is, the best there was, the best there ever will be. Orange Cassidy presents a different kind of competitiveness, and I think a different kind of masculinity, which we got a little bit from Daniel Bryan, but you saw also with Daniel Bryan how hard it was for him to push himself into the main event, given that he was departing from this traditional conception of what a champion wrestler should be like and how they should act. About keeping characters in boxes, this seems to be a particular issue with Vince McMahon, where he said to Miro, the former Rusev, you know, don't look at the people, don't smile, don't do this and that. He said he had a conversation with Vince and he told me that with Rusev Day, they were just mocking me. They didn't mean it. And I think a real issue here with Vince was the problem wasn't just that Rusev was funny, but that Vince wanted Rusev to be a particular kind of character. He wanted him to be an evil Russian monster, even though he's Bulgarian. And that anytime Miro tried, and this Vince just could not see him as anything else but that. And despite the fact that obviously the crowd was getting behind Rusev and chanting Rusev Day, Vince just couldn't see that as them genuinely caring about him and wanting to cheer for him. All right, so Jim Cornette. And, as Kit mentioned earlier, I hate it when I kind of agree with Jim Cornette. And this might be a little bit of a heel turn for me in this talk, because to some degree, I agree with Jim Cornette here, though I think the vitriol is completely uncalled for, where he says, I don't ever want to see wrestling anymore if this is what they've fucking turned it into. He's talking about the Stadium Stampede, that it's late night television, a Benny Hill sketch. Any sport is entertainment, but it doesn't have to be silly, stupid, and hokey, and it doesn't have to be fake and contrived, phony, amateurish, and juvenile. Again, if he's worried about it being juvenile, what did he have to say about the entire Attitude Era? I guess he didn't like that either that much, but he didn't, think that it wasn't wrestling or that he didn't want to see it at all. Chris Jericho responds saying, this is the style of wrestling that I love, where there's a little bit of wackiness, there's some comedy, there's some seriousness. I think the truth in what Jim Cornette is worried about, to some degree, and I'm of two minds about this, because I really like when this is done sometimes, but I think it can be done well or badly, is what you might think of as fourth wall breaking, but really drawing attention to the artifice of pro wrestling. And this goes back to a little bit of what Kit was talking about in terms of wrestling happening. Like when you have the Stadium Stampede, which is a kind of cinematic sort of match, the parts that bothered me a little bit were the parts where, look, they're not actually doing this thing. It's not actually happening in front of you. And Jim Cornette has pointed out that one of the cool things about wrestling as opposed to watching a movie is they're really doing their own stunts. But once you're able to make camera cuts and things like that in a way that occludes what's actually happening, it does take something away from it. So the part of the Stadium Stampede that bothered me the most was the Northern Light suplexes for 100 yards. Because one, they clearly didn't actually do that. But even worse than that, one of the problems with wrestling, with a lot of wrestling, I think nowadays, is that the moves mean less and less. They're not sold in a way that makes them meaningful. So if someone did basically 100 or more Northern Light suplexes to you, if a Northern Light suplex is to mean anything in wrestling, your back should be broken. You should be out for a month or a year. But that's not how it was sold. So now if someone does a Northern Light suplex in a match, then, why take that as a finish or like a move that actually causes any damage to someone? It used to be Owen Hart's finisher, but now it's just the move, the meaning of the move has been sacrificed for the sake of a quick joke. And I think that's the problem that a lot of wrestling critics have with wrestling nowadays, where you do draw attention to wrestling's artifice, is that it's just for the sake of a quick joke, and it's decreasing the value of wrestling. It's making it harder for people to lose themselves and immerse themselves in wrestling. The moves no longer mean very much. But I do think there's a good way of doing this. So I loved Kota Ibushi's matches with Yoshihiko in DDT, because there's a sort of contract made with the audience where it's like, okay, we know that the blow-up doll Yoshihiko isn't actually doing moves to Ibushi, but Ibushi is selling the moves as if they're happening. And he's using his skill to make it look like Yoshihiko is really doing the moves to him, which on the one hand makes this really interesting point about how wrestling moves often have a lot more to do with the person taking them than the person giving them, and sort of exposes the business a little bit, peels back the business in some way, but while still making it an engaging, coherent, logically coherent spectacle and presentation. Whereas, and I think the same is true for like the Invisible Wrestlers match that Bryce Remsburg did, which was cool because it drew attention to the role of the audience as a co-creator in the match, but it did it in this sort of consistent way that you could buy into. Whereas I thought Joey Janela's social distancing rules match just didn't have that same kind of coherence. There wasn't any explanation or any good reason for why they were able to effectively do moves on each other from a distance. Did they have superpowers? Like, what is it? It was just kind of a cheap joke about social distancing. And then later in the match, there's this funny moment where they have to disinfect a steel chair, but in order to get each other with the steel chair, they actually hit each other. So they weren't even consistent in the sort of rules of the universe. And that bothers me. And Orange Cassidy does his little ineffectual kicks and slaps to an opponent, but they are ineffectual. The opponent doesn't sell them, which is what makes it work. If the opponent was to sell it, then it would be like, oh, this is kind of stupid and phony. So again, I think the traditionalists have somewhat of a point in some cases. And I do think that while the business doesn't need to be protected in the sense of people actually believing that it's real, again, this notion of kayfabe as protecting the audience's experience. And I think this goes for other art forms as well. I think, breaking the fourth wall can be done well or badly, whether it's in comic books or in movies or whatever. It can be done to make a really interesting point, or it can be done for cheap laughs. And the latter can often be very harmful to the art form as a whole. And that's it. Thanks, everybody.